My name is Alex. I'm 54 years old. For 30 of those years, I worked search and rescue in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. I was a senior technician, the guy they called when a hiker went missing in a blizzard, or a climber took a bad fall off a rock face in the Weminuche Wilderness. I've seen things in those mountains. I've seen what exposure does to a body, what a 1,000-foot fall can do. I've seen mountain lions up close and tracked grizzly bears that wandered down from Wyoming. I thought I knew the woods, every sound, every track, every shadow. I was competent. I was confident. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you is the reason I live in a second-floor apartment in Denver now, 100 miles from the nearest trailhead. It's the reason I haven't touched a rifle in 6 years, and why I can't sleep without the city lights bleeding through my blinds. It was early October, the first week of the second rifle season.
The aspens had already peaked, their leaves a brittle golden carpet on the forest floor. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the promise of winter. This trip was an annual tradition. Me, Cal, Brian, and Corey. We'd been doing it for almost 15 years, ever since we all worked together on the SAR team. Cal was my oldest friend, steady and quiet, a man who could read a topo map like it was a newspaper. Brian was the joker, always ready with a bad pun, a little too loud, but his heart was in the right place. Corey was the youngest, ex-Marine, a force recon guy who moved through the woods with a quiet intensity that could be unsettling if you didn't know him. He was our tactical expert, the one who obsessed over gear and ballistics. Our spot was a pair of old, privately owned cabins deep in the Uncompahgre National Forest, miles from any paved road.
To get there, you had to take a county highway, then a gravel Forest Service road, and finally a 2-track dirt path that was more of a suggestion than a road. It dead-ended at a small clearing where the cabins stood. They weren't much, log walls, tin roofs, a wood-burning stove in each, but they were dry, and they were ours for the week. We had 2 trucks, my Ford and Brian's Chevy. We'd haul in enough food, water, and firewood to last, park the trucks, and that was it. We were off the grid. No cell service, no electricity, just the 4 of us and a few 100,000 acres of wilderness. It was our version of paradise. That first day was like any other. We arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked the gear, and split the first logs for the stoves. Brian was already making jokes about Cal's snoring being a registered seismic event. Corey was meticulously cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day, laying out each component on an oilcloth. I got a fire going in the main cabin, the one we used for cooking and eating, and started on dinner. The smell of frying bacon and coffee filled the small space, mingling with the scent of wood smoke. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A familiar sense of peace settled over me. This was my church, my sanctuary. We ate, told the same old stories we always did, and planned our hunt for the morning. Cal and I would take the high ridge to the north. Brian and Corey would work the lower basin to the east, where a creek ran through a thicket of willows. The plan was solid. We knew this area. We'd taken elk here before. After cleaning up, we sat on the porch of the main cabin, sipping whiskey and watching the stars come out. The sky at that altitude is something else. A black velvet cloth littered with diamonds. The Milky Way was a bright, shimmering band overhead.
It was dead quiet, the kind of profound silence you only find deep in the mountains. Or it should have been. That was the first wrong thing, the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet, punctuated by the chirp of crickets or the distant hoot of an owl. This was a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath. I noticed it first, a prickling on the back of my neck. I stopped mid-sentence, listening. Cal noticed it too. He lowered his cup and tilted his head,
his eyes scanning the dark tree line that ringed our clearing. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Brian laughed. "Hear what, old man? The sound of your knees creaking?" "No," Corey said, his voice flat. He was already on his feet, his gaze fixed on the woods. "He's right. It's too quiet. No insects, no night birds." We all fell silent then, straining our ears. He was right. The familiar soundscape of the forest at night was gone. It was just nothing. An empty, dead stillness.
It was deeply unnatural, and it put a knot in my stomach. We sat like that for a full minute, the whiskey forgotten in our hands. The feeling of being watched was immense, a physical pressure against my skin. Then we heard it, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife, a sharp, resonant thwack. It came from the woods, maybe 100 yards out. It was followed by another, then another. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was rhythmic, deliberate. It sounded like someone hitting a thick tree with a baseball bat. "What the hell is that?" Brian asked, his jokey tone gone, replaced by a nervous edge. "Could be a woodpecker," Cal offered, but his voice lacked conviction. A woodpecker at night? And that sound was too deep, too powerful. "No," Corey said, shaking his head slowly. "That's wood on wood, something big." We listened as the knocking continued for another minute, a steady, unnerving beat in the oppressive silence. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in felt even heavier than before. We looked at each other, the flickering light from the cabin window casting long shadows on our faces. "Probably just some other hunters messing with us," Brian said, trying to reclaim his bravado. "Trying to spook the new guys." "There are no new guys, Brian," I said quietly. "No one else comes this far in. We haven't seen another soul since we left the highway." We didn't have a good answer. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a dead tree falling, breaking branches on the way down. But the rhythm, the deliberate spacing of the sounds, argued against that. It felt intentional. We finished our drinks in silence and decided to call it a night. But the easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a low-grade hum of anxiety. As I lay in my bunk in the second cabin, listening to Cal's steady breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the woods we were in. I stared at the dark ceiling for hours before I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, the world seemed normal again. The sun was bright, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the birds were singing. The oppressive silence of the night was gone. Over breakfast, Brian was back to his old self, joking that we were all getting spooked by shadows. Corey was quiet, cleaning his rifle again. Cal and I just exchanged a look. We were both experienced enough to know that when the woods go silent, you pay attention. But in the clear light of day, it was easy to let the rational part of your brain take over. We split up as planned. Cal and I started our climb up the long, sloping ridge to the north. The air was thin and cold, and our breath plumed in front of us. We moved slowly, glassing the terrain with our binoculars, looking for any sign of elk. For a couple of hours, it was a perfectly normal hunt. We saw mule deer, a flock of wild turkeys, but no elk. The woods felt right again. The unease of the previous night began to feel like an overreaction. Around mid-morning, we were cutting across a steep, timbered slope when Cal stopped dead in front of me. He held up a hand, signaling for silence. He was staring at something on the ground. I moved up beside him. It was a set of tracks. They were pressed deep into the damp earth and pine needles. The print was huge, easily 16 inches long, but it was the shape that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was vaguely canine, with 4 distinct toe pads and a larger heel pad. But there were claw marks, long and sharp, dug deep into the soil. And the stride. The distance between the prints was enormous, at least 7 or 8 feet. This wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a mountain lion. It was far, far too big to be a bear walking on its hind legs, and the print was all wrong anyway. A bear's hind foot is plantigrade, flat-footed like a human's. This was digitigrade, like a dog or a cat, but impossibly large. "Alex," Cal said, his voice a strained whisper. "What in God's name makes a track like that?" I knelt down, my rifle slung over my shoulder forgotten. I traced the edge of the print with my finger, not quite touching it. The sheer size was baffling. I'd seen grizzly tracks that were smaller than this. We followed the tracks for a short distance. They moved in a straight line, up the steep slope, with an economy of movement that suggested immense power. They didn't meander or sniff around like a bear would. They moved with purpose. We lost the trail on a patch of rocky ground. Shaken, we decided to continue our hunt, but the enthusiasm was gone. Every shadow in the trees looked menacing. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. An hour later, my radio crackled to life. It was Corey. "Alex, you there? Over." His voice was tight, strained. "Go ahead, Corey, what's up?"
Over. You and Cal need to get to our position, now, East Basin, by the creek, and bring your rifles. Over. There was no room for argument in his tone. What is it? I asked. Did you find elk? Over. There was a pause. No, he said, his voice dropping lower. No, not elk. Just get here, fast, and be careful. Over and out. The radio went silent. Cal and I looked at each other. Corey was not a man given to drama. If he said to come fast, you came fast. We abandoned our hunt and began the long traverse across the mountain, moving as quickly as we could through the thick timber and deadfall. It took us over an hour. As we got closer to the basin, a new smell hit me, carried on the breeze. It was the coppery metallic scent of blood. We found them standing near the creek in a small grassy meadow. Brian was pale, leaning against a tree, looking like he was about to be sick. Corey stood ramrod straight, his rifle held at a low ready, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding trees.
In the center of the meadow was the source of the smell. It was a large bull elk, or what was left of it. It had been killed recently. Steam was still rising from the body in the cold air. But it wasn't the kill that was wrong. It was what had been done to it. The animal had been ripped open from throat to pelvis. Its internal organs were gone, not scattered and eaten by scavengers, but removed, completely. The chest cavity was an empty, bloody cavern. The ground around the carcass was soaked in blood, but there were no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. More disturbing, the head had been twisted completely around, its massive antlers dug into the dirt of its own back. The neck was broken, but it took an unbelievable amount of force to do that to a mature bull elk. "We found it like this 10 minutes ago," Corey said, his voice low and hard. "No feeding marks, no scavenger sign, just this." "What could do this?" Brian stammered. "A bear?"
A whole pack of wolves? Look at the ground, Corey commanded. We saw them immediately. All around the carcass, the soft earth by the creek was pocked with the same impossible tracks we had found on the ridge. Dozens of them. They were everywhere. Some were deeper than others, suggesting a creature of immense weight. But there was something else. Something that made my blood run cold. Near the elk's head, several of the tracks were different. They weren't the large canine prints. They were smaller, misshapen, but unmistakably bipedal. 2 feet. Like a man, but the proportions were all wrong. The toes too long, the heel too narrow. It was field dressed, I said,
the words feeling like ash in my mouth. The organs had been removed with a terrifying precision, not just torn out. Something field-dressed this elk and then just left it, and broke its neck like a twig, Cal added, his face grim. We stood there in silence, the scale of the wrongness washing over us.
The unnatural quiet, the knocking, the impossible tracks, and now this ritualistic-looking slaughter. These were not random events. They were connected. My SAR training kicked in, the part of my brain that assesses threats and makes a plan. "We're done," I announced. "The hunt is over. We're packing up and getting out of here. Now." No one argued. Even Brian, for once, was silent. The four of us, all experienced outdoorsmen, 2 with combat and rescue training, were thoroughly spooked. We started the long hike back to the cabins, moving as a tight group. Corey took point, Cal and Brian were in the middle, and I brought up the rear. We all had our rifles off our shoulders now, held in our hands. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind in the pines made my heart hammer against my ribs. The woods no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like enemy territory. We were being watched, hunted, and for the first time in my life, I felt like prey. It was late afternoon by the time we got back to the clearing. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows from the trees. The cabins looked small and vulnerable. The first thing we noticed was the door to the main cabin. It was slightly ajar. I knew for a fact I had closed it securely before we left that morning. Corey held up a hand, and we all froze. He crept forward, his rifle pressed to his shoulder, and pushed the door open with the barrel. He swept the interior, then signaled for us to follow. We entered cautiously. The cabin was a wreck. Our food supplies had been torn apart. Sacks of flour and sugar were ripped open, their contents dusted over everything. Cans of food were dented, some punctured by what looked like massive teeth. But nothing was eaten. It was just destroyed. Our gear was thrown about, packs torn, sleeping bags shredded.
It was an act of pure, malicious vandalism. "It was in here," Brian whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "It was inside the cabin." My gaze fell on the heavy oak table in the center of the room. Scratched deep into the surface were 5 long, parallel gouges, each as deep as my finger. Claw marks. Whatever had done this had hands, or something very much like them, and it was incredibly strong. "It's sending a message," Cal said, his voice heavy. "It's telling us to leave." "Then let's listen," I said, my own voice shaking slightly. "Grab what's salvageable. We load the trucks and we're gone." We worked with a frantic energy, throwing our remaining gear into the beds of the trucks. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the clearing was sinking into a deep twilight. The temperature was dropping fast. I was shoving my pack into the back of my Ford when Brian let out a strangled cry. "My keys," he said, patting his pockets frantically. "They're not here."
They must have fallen out when I was packing. I think they're in the other cabin. "Go get them, quick," I urged, my eyes scanning the darkening tree line. "We need to go." Brian ran to the second cabin, the one we slept in, and disappeared inside. Cal was trying to tie down a tarp over the gear in his truck bed. Corey was standing guard, his rifle pointed towards the forest, slowly sweeping back and forth. A minute passed. Then 2. "What's taking him so long?" I muttered, an icy dread coiling in my gut. Just as I said it, a sound came from the second cabin. It wasn't Brian. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. It was a sound of pure, bottomless malice. It was followed by a crash, the sound of splintering wood, and then a scream. A terrible,
high-pitched scream of pure agony and terror. It was Brian. The scream was cut off abruptly. For a heartbeat, we were all frozen in shock. Then Corey yelled, "Alex, Cal, get to the main cabin, now!
Move!" His military training took over. He was already running towards the main cabin, the one with the sturdier door and the wood stove. Cal and I didn't hesitate. We sprinted across the clearing, the 20 yards feeling like a mile. We slammed the heavy door shut just as Corey threw his weight against it, ramming the thick wooden bolt home. We were breathing heavily, our hearts pounding. Outside there was a terrible, wet, tearing sound followed by a heavy crunch. The sounds were sickeningly familiar to me from my SAR work. They were the sounds of a large predator dismantling a body. We stood in the wrecked cabin, plunged into near darkness now that the door was closed. The only light came from the faint embers still glowing in the wood stove. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the switch. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating Cal's pale, sweat-streaked face and Corey's grim, determined expression.
"Brian,"
Cal started, his voice cracking. "He's gone," Corey said, his voice devoid of emotion. "There's nothing we can do for him. Our priority now is survival." He moved to one of the small windows, peering cautiously through a crack in the wooden shutter. "We stay here. We defend this position until sunrise." Then the first impact hit the wall of the cabin. It was like being hit by a car. The whole structure shuddered, the logs groaned. Something immensely heavy and powerful had just thrown itself against the wall. It was followed by a furious, snarling roar that was unlike any animal I had ever heard. It was deep, like a bear's, but it had a ragged canine edge to it, and underneath it, a terrifying hint of something like guttural speech. Another impact hit the wall, harder this time. Dust and bits of dried moss rained down from between the logs.
Then came a scratching sound, the screech of long claws dragging down the wooden exterior. I moved to the other window, my rifle in my hands. I peered through a small gap. My blood went cold. In the deepening twilight, I could see it. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadow, but it was there. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall. It was standing on 2 legs, but they were bent backwards like a dog's. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, wider than a man's, and covered in thick, dark fur. Its arms were too long for its body, ending in large, dark hands with what looked like dirty yellow claws. But the head was what broke my mind. It was the head of a monstrous wolf or a dire dog, long-snouted, with pointed ears and eyes that glowed with a faint, reflected light from my headlamp. It turned its head slightly, and I saw its profile against the last light in the sky. It was undeniably canine, a bipedal wolf the size of a grizzly bear.
It took a step forward, and I saw that it wasn't alone. Another one emerged from the trees behind it, and then a third. They moved with a terrifying, loping gait, their long arms swinging. They weren't animals. They moved with an intelligence, a purpose. They were communicating with each other in a series of low growls and clicks. They were surrounding the cabin. 3 of them, I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. At least 3. "Positions," Corey barked, snapping me out of my terrified trance. "Cal, you take the back wall. Alex, front door. I'll cover the windows. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. Conserve your ammo. Aim for the center mass. Treat them like hostiles." His commands gave us a focus, a purpose beyond just being terrified. We moved to our assigned positions, the small, wrecked cabin becoming our fortress. Outside, the scratching and sniffing continued. One of them was at the door. I could hear it breathing, a wet, rasping sound, right on the other side of the thick wood. I could smell it, a rank, musky odor like wet dog and rot. Then the doorknob began to rattle. My heart stopped. It was trying the handle. It knew what a doorknob was. This wasn't just a beast trying to break in. This was an intelligent creature trying to figure out a lock. I backed away from the door, raising my rifle. The rattling stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then a tremendous bang as something slammed against the door, making the heavy bolt shudder in its bracket. "They're testing for weaknesses," Corey said from the window. "Just like we would." The siege began in earnest. They started throwing their weight against the walls, one after another, trying to find a weak spot. The whole cabin shook with each impact. Then, from the back, Cal yelled, "Window!" I spun around. Through the rear window, I saw one of the creatures. It was standing right outside, its monstrous face pressed against the glass. Its eyes were yellow and filled with a terrifying, hateful intelligence. It stared right at Cal, and then it raised one of its long arms and smashed its fist through the glass pane. Shards of glass exploded into the cabin. Cal fired his rifle, the boom deafening in the small space. The creature recoiled with a yelp of pain and rage, but it wasn't a fatal shot. It disappeared from the window. "I hit it," Cal shouted. "I think I hit it in the shoulder." But the temporary victory was short-lived. A heavy thud came from outside, near the front of the cabin. It was followed by a sound I will never forget, the sound of tearing metal. A horrible, grinding, screeching sound. Corey peered through his window again. "The trucks," he said, his voice grim. "They're destroying the trucks." I looked through the crack in the shutter and saw it. One of the creatures was at my Ford. It had its claws hooked under the edge of the hood and was peeling it back like the lid of a tin can. The metal screamed in protest. With a final, monstrous heave, it ripped the hood completely off and threw it aside. Then it plunged its head into the engine compartment and started tearing out wires and hoses with its teeth. It was systematic. It was deliberate. It was disabling our only means of escape. Despair washed over me, cold and absolute. We were trapped. Miles from civilization, with no vehicle, surrounded by monsters that were methodically taking us apart. Suddenly, there was a new sound, a loud, rhythmic thump, thump, thump against the side wall. It wasn't the sound of a body hitting the logs. It was something harder. "What is that?" Cal asked, his voice trembling. Corey's face was pale in the gloom. "It's using a rock," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "It's picked up a rock, and it's using it as a battering ram." Tool use. The realization was another crack in the foundation of my reality. These things weren't just smart. They were tactical. They were intelligent in a way that I couldn't comprehend. The thumping continued, each blow making the logs groan. We knew it was only a matter of time before they broke through. We spent the next few hours in a state of heightened terror. They would go quiet for long stretches, playing on our nerves, making us wonder where they were. Then the assault would begin again, a sudden impact on the roof, a claw scratching at the door, the rhythmic thumping of the rock against the wall. We were running on pure adrenaline. Sometime after midnight, the thumping stopped. A long, unnerving silence descended. "Where did they go?" Cal whispered. "They're still out there," Corey said. "They're changing tactics." He was right. A moment later, a heavy object crashed through the already broken rear window, landing on the floor with a thud. It wasn't a rock. It was dark, wet, and misshapen,
I shone my headlamp on it. It was Brian's severed head. His eyes were wide open in a mask of eternal terror. His rucksack, containing his keys, was still slung over one shoulder, the head having been ripped from the torso with the pack still attached. Cal let out a retching sob and turned away. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to brace myself against the wall. It wasn't just killing us. It was terrorizing us. It was a psychological attack. The distraction worked perfectly. While we were reeling in horror from what they'd thrown inside, one of them made its move. A massive, dark hand, bigger than a dinner plate, smashed through the wooden shutter on the front window, splintering the dry wood. It clawed blindly, trying to get a purchase, to rip the rest of the shutter away. Corey reacted instantly. He swung the butt of his rifle like a club, smashing it down on the hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a howl of pain from outside.
The hand was yanked back out of the window, but in that moment, as Corey was focused on the front window, the side wall finally gave way. With a deafening crack, two of the logs, weakened by the constant pounding of the rock, splintered and broke inward. A huge, dark shape surged through the opening. The creature was inside the cabin, with us. It was chaos. The thing was enormous, its head scraping the low ceiling. It filled the small room with its bulk and its foul, fetid stench. Its yellow eyes glowed with feral hatred. It lunged for Cal. Cal screamed and fired his rifle from the hip. The shot went wide. The creature swatted the rifle from his hands, the weapon flying across the room and clattering against the far wall. It grabbed Cal by the front of his jacket and lifted him off his feet as if he weighed nothing. Cal kicked and struggled, but it was useless. "Corey!" I screamed. Corey had already turned. He brought his rifle up and fired 2 shots, rapid fire, into the creature's chest. The heavy .30-06 rounds hit it with massive force, staggering it. It roared in pain and fury, dropping Cal to the floor. Cal scrambled away, crawling towards the wood stove. The creature turned its attention to Corey, its face a mask of rage. It ignored me completely, identifying Corey as the primary threat. It charged him. Corey tried to fire again, but the creature was too fast. It crashed into him, and the two of them went down in a tangle of limbs and fury. I heard Corey grunt as the air was forced from his lungs. The creature's jaws, filled with long, yellow teeth, snapped inches from his face. I raised my own rifle, but I couldn't get a clear shot. They were rolling on the floor, a chaotic, violent struggle. I saw Corey drive the barrel of his rifle up under the creature's jaw. It howled and reared back, giving Corey a precious second. He tried to scramble away, but the second creature was already climbing through the hole in the wall. It landed lightly on its feet and immediately lunged for Corey, who was still on the ground. It was on him before he could get up. I saw its long arms wrap around him. I heard the sickening snap of his spine. Corey went limp. The light in his eyes vanished. The first creature, the one Corey had shot, was wounded but far from dead. It pushed itself to its feet, blood leaking from 2 dark holes in its chest. It looked at me, its yellow eyes burning with hate. It took a step towards me. I knew I was next. "Alex!" Cal screamed from behind me. I didn't turn. I fired my rifle. The shot hit the creature square in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall. It just growled, a low, rumbling sound, and kept coming. I worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round. My hands were slick with sweat. I was too slow. It was almost on top of me when a bright flash of light erupted from behind me. Cal had managed to open the door of the wood stove. He had grabbed the cast iron poker, its tip glowing cherry red from the embers, and lunged forward. He shoved the glowing hot poker deep into the creature's side, into one of the wounds Corey had made. The effect was instantaneous. The creature let out a shriek that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was a high-pitched scream. It thrashed wildly, knocking over the table, and staggered back, away from us. It looked down at the smoldering wound in its side, then back at us, its eyes filled with a new emotion: fear. It stumbled backwards, crashing into the second creature, which was still crouched over Corey's body. It let out a series of sharp, guttural barks. The second creature looked up, saw its wounded packmate, and immediately backed away from Corey. Together, they scrambled back through the hole in the wall and disappeared into the night.
We were left in the sudden ringing silence, standing in the wrecked cabin with the bodies of our friends. We were alive. I didn't know why. Maybe the fire had scared them. Maybe they decided we weren't worth the effort. Or maybe, and this is the thought that haunts me, they had just finished their game and had gotten bored. A faint gray light was beginning to filter through the broken windows. Dawn was coming. The long night was over. Cal and I didn't speak. There were no words. We were both in shock, running on the last dregs of adrenaline. We knew we had to move. They might come back. We grabbed what we could: our remaining rifles, a handful of ammunition, a single first aid kit. We didn't look at Brian's truck. We knew his body was out there, but we couldn't face it. We couldn't look at Corey's body, lying broken on the floor. There was no time for grief. There was only survival. We left the cabin and started walking.
We headed south, away from the ridge where we'd seen the tracks, away from the basin where the elk lay. We walked for hours, pushing through thick brush and climbing steep ravines. Cal was limping. He'd twisted his ankle badly when the first creature had dropped him. Every step was agony for him, but he never complained. We just kept moving, fueled by terror. Every shadow seemed to hold a tall canine shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a low growl. We kept looking over our shoulders, expecting to see them loping through the trees behind us, but the woods were empty. It was late in the afternoon when we stumbled onto a logging road. It was overgrown and barely used, but it was a sign of civilization. We followed it for what felt like an eternity. My legs were numb, my mind a hollowed-out shell of shock and exhaustion. Finally, around dusk, we heard it. The distant rumble of an engine. A beat-up logging truck came around a bend in the road. It slowed to a stop when the driver saw us.
He was a big man with a grizzled beard, and his eyes went wide when he saw the state we were in. We were covered in dirt and blood, our clothes were torn, and we were carrying rifles with a haunted, wide-eyed look that must have been terrifying. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "What happened to you two? There?" I just nodded, unable to speak. "Bear," I croaked. "A bad one." He helped us into the cab of his truck without another word. The feeling of the door closing, of being inside a moving vehicle, of leaving that forest behind, was the greatest relief I have ever known. He drove us to the nearest town, a small place called Silverton, and dropped us directly at the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a man named Davis. He listened patiently as I tried to tell him what happened. I left out the impossible parts. I couldn't bring myself to say the words dogmen or bipedal wolves. I just told him we were attacked at our cabin by a pack of abnormally large, aggressive animals.
I told him they killed 2 of our friends. I described the tracks, the way they destroyed the trucks, the way they broke into the cabin. He listened, nodding, his face a mask of professional sympathy. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Son," he said, his voice gentle, "it sounds like you boys had a real bad run-in with a grizzly. A big one, maybe with cubs. They can be aggressive this time of year, getting ready for hibernation. Ripping up a camp like that, it's not unheard of." "It wasn't a bear," I said, my voice rising. "I've worked in these mountains my whole life. I know what a bear does. I know what a bear track looks like. This was not a bear. He gave me a patient, pitying look. The look you give someone who is clearly in shock, who is traumatized and not thinking straight. We'll send a deputy and a guy from Parks and Wildlife up there in the morning to check it out, he said. We'll recover your friends. I'm sorry for your loss. That was it.
I gave my statement. Cal gave his. The official report listed the cause of death for Brian and Corey as a severe bear mauling. They took our rifles as evidence. A few days later, they told us they had recovered the bodies. When I asked about the tracks, about the destroyed trucks, the sheriff just shrugged. He said the scene was pretty torn up. Scavengers had already been there, and it was hard to tell much. He said the damage to the trucks could have been done by a bear looking for food inside. He dismissed everything. A tidy, simple explanation for an event that defied all explanation. We were cleared. There was no investigation, no follow-up. Just 2 dead men and an official story that was a complete and utter lie. The case was closed. As Cal and I were leaving the station a few days later, one of the older deputies, a man close to retirement, pulled me aside. He was a leathery old-timer who looked like he'd been born in the mountain.
He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. You listen to me, he said, his voice a low whisper. I read your full statement, the first one, before the sheriff had you simplify it, about the things standing on 2 legs. I just stared at him, my heart starting to pound again. I've been working this county for 40 years, he went on. Every 5 or 10 years, something happens up in that high country. A hunter disappears. A whole family vanishes from their campsite. They find their car, their gear, but never the people. The official story is always a bear, or they got lost, or they just walked away. But the locals? We have other names for it. He looked me dead in the eye. You were lucky. You got out. Don't ever go back there. You understand me? There are some places in these mountains man was never meant to be. You leave it alone. You let the dead lie. He patted my shoulder and walked away, leaving me standing there, frozen. It wasn't a confirmation, not really.
But it was an acknowledgement. Someone else knew, or at least they suspected. I wasn't crazy. That was 6 years ago. I never went back. I sold my house, my truck, all my gear. I moved to the city, as far from the deep woods as I could get. Cal did the same. He lives in Arizona now, in the middle of the desert. We talk on the phone sometimes, but we never talk about that trip. We can't. There's a gulf between us and the rest of the world, the gulf of what we know. I have nightmares every night. I see those yellow eyes, the impossibly long arms, the canine head on a bipedal body. I hear Corey's spine snap. I see Brian's head hitting the floor of the cabin. Survivor's guilt is a heavy burden. Why me? Why Cal? Was it just luck? Or did they let us go? A message to anyone else who might trespass on their territory. I don't have answers. I only have the trauma, a permanent scar on my soul. I used to love the mountains. They were my home. Now I look at pictures of them and all I feel is a cold, primal fear. I know what's in there. I know that beneath the beauty in the silence, there are things that walk on 2 legs. Things with the heads of wolves and the intelligence of men. Things that hate us for reasons we will never understand. So if you go into the woods, the deep woods, far from the trails and the campgrounds, listen. Listen for the silence. Listen for the sounds that don't belong. And if you find a track you can't identify, or a kill that doesn't make sense, Don't be a hero. Don't try to be rational. Turn around and walk away. Run. Because some truths aren't meant to be discovered. They're meant to be survived. And the world is much older and much stranger than we are taught to believe. I know. I was there. And I will carry the memory of it to my grave, a silent monument to the friends I lost in the San Juan Mountains.